I want to introduce our first speaker. Mark Lamontia is a recently retired top scientist at DuPont Chemical. He is an inventor, a mechanical engineer, and has been speaking on apologetic topics for years at colleges and universities all over the Northeast. He's an amazing person. If you get in a conversation with him afterward, you'll quickly learn that. And if you have science questions, he would love to answer them. And he's going to come present a session here on Does Science Disprove God? So let's welcome him as he comes.
Yeah, I just retired 43 years as an engineering scientist, so I've got this talk, Does Science Bury God? And so you got these two young ladies, and the first one says, hey, science buries atheism. Wow. So that's what I want to try and convince you guys. You know, really, does science bury God? Does science bury atheism? So let's go do that. So before we start, we have to distinguish between two different kinds of science. There's the good kind and the bad kind. And here's the good kind. It's experimental testing, which you learn in school, hypothesis testing with experiments. And when you do the experiment, you follow the evidence wherever it leads, and that's highly reliable, and that's cool. And I was an engineering scientist. There's me back in 1982 with all this instrumentation and all that. And so I like experimental science. But the science type 2, the bad kind, is when science is used as a religion, right? Scientism, which is what is the best explanation for everything, assuming at the outset that God has nothing to do with it. Now, that's a problem because scientism naturally leads to atheism, the belief that there isn't any God. Why is that? Because science needs a creation story. We got all these animals, we got the original life, we got the universe and everything, so you got to get that somehow, right? You got to get that somehow because we're here. So for atheism to be true, scientism, or the related things, naturalism, materialism, have to be true. Right? So are they true? Are they true? So that's what we're going to look at. And you get this lady kind of describes what happens in modern culture. Let's hear what she says. Well, we had...
I don't believe in God, first of all. Maybe because I grew up in an age of science.
All right, so she doesn't believe in God, right? Now, there's good news. Rumors of God's death have been greatly exaggerated, and so we will find in this talk that science points to God and not away. But in the first part of the talk, we're going to hear about the bad news. Now, I always put one of these outlines here so you can see where the talk is going. So the first thing we're going to talk about is how did we get to scientism and atheism in the first place? So we'll do a definition of what is atheism, right? So here it is. There is no God. Jesus never lived. Man arose gradually from lower animals by a mindless, undirected process. Religion is superstition. Religion should be eradicated worldwide. How about that? Human beings have no intrinsic value. Free will, the thought that you make your own choices, that's an illusion. Objective morality, right and wrong, that's an illusion. Life has no ultimate purpose, and when we die, that's it. We're gone. That's the end of us. So here's another way to kind of describe it. This is William Provine. He's dead now, but when he was a professor of biology at Cornell University, he taught the freshman biology class. So imagine you go into college, your first day, and this is what you hear.
Let me summarize my views on what modern evolutionary biology tells us, loud and clear, and I must say that these are basically Darwin's views. There are no gods, no purposive forces of any kind, no life after death. When I die, I am absolutely certain that I'm going to be completely dead. That's just all that's going to be the end of me. There's no ultimate foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning in life, and no free will for humans either. What an unintelligible idea.
Wow. So how the heck did we get here? Because in ancient times, most people believed in God, right? In ancient times. So if you look at this, through the middle of the 15th century, the 1400s, the power in the world was connected and concentrated in the Catholic Church and with kings, with monarchies. But then there's this guy Gutenberg, and in Renaissance Europe, 1439, he came up with a way to make the printing press. All right, so that changed everything. That permanently altered society, because now you didn't have to get all your information from the priests. You could get it from books. You could read newspapers and things like that. And those things transcended borders and captured the masses. And they had something called the Reformation. You learned about that in school. And that broke the monopoly of the church and the literate elite on ideas and education. And so the people confronted the power of the kings and the priests, right? And it started a middle class. Now, around the same time, so this is in the 1600s, smartest scientist that ever lived, Isaac Newton, really a genius for sure, he came up with mechanics, gravity, calculus, optics, and he described the universe in terms of mathematics. Pretty cool, right? So this led to the idea that the universe was kind of a mechanical artifact. And we still think that today, right? We sort of think it kind of runs on its own. You don't need God to do anything, right? And we can study the universe without referring to somebody that set it up or is keeping it going. And Newton didn't intend that to be the result. Newton, 95% of the stuff he ever wrote was on theism. Only 5% was on science, but he had this effect of people thought the universe could kind of run on its own. And so the idea of God started to kind of recede into the background. And so instead of having theisms where you have an active God, the idea of God kind of receded into the background. Like he was back there somewhere really far away, maybe, you know. And so if there might be a God, but he's not really present. He's not really interested in our world. If God exists, existing is about the only thing God had ever done. And so this changed in the 1800s what science was. And you had the good definition of science, the methodological definition, which is you do experiments and follow the evidence wherever it leads, and it might lead to nature and it might lead to God, and either one of those is okay. And it changed to what we have today, which is a metaphysical definition of science, which is a search for everything with a naturalistic explanation. Instead of either God or nature, it was law and chance. It was law and chance, and so God kind of lost his job. And so the philosophers insisted that science must assume the existence of a material universe. Not a God-centered universe, a material universe, right? So what happened? What happened? You've got this unrestricted circulation of books. You've got information and revolutionary ideas that transcended the borders from England to France to Spain to Germany, all those countries. You've got the opposition to kings. You've got opposition to the Catholic Church. Everybody's questioning religious authority. What happened? You got revolutions. You got the French Revolution. You got people off with their heads. You know, all these people, you're out of here, right? Now, 100 years later, Charles Darwin comes along, 1859, and he writes The Origin of Species. And in The Origin of Species, new species have appeared during the Earth's history by a natural process called descent with modification. Then a cool picture, that's the Grand Gallery of Evolution in Paris. Now, Darwin says this evolutionary process accounts for all this life from a microscopic ancestor. And this process is so effective that it could accomplish all the biological craftsmanship that people in previous times had thought to require the guiding hand of a creator God. So he replaced God. So God, he's out of a job, right? Now, in the United States, if you grew up in the 60s and the 70s, you had this view of kind of a scientific age of science. At the end of World War II, World War II was like mechanized warfare, right? And for good or for bad, right? Like there's some bad, right? Nuclear armament. It looks like science could do anything. It had all this power, right? So you had all this mechanized warfare. Then in the late 50s, you had the very first vaccines, polio vaccines, right? That religion wasn't doing that, science was doing that. You had the discovery of the secret of life, DNA, you had the Miller experiment where life kind of emerged in the laboratory, right? And then you got this guy, Dr. Christian Barnard in the 1960s. He came up with the very first heart transplant. So science was doing everything, and people had a scientific outlook. And the United States government really pushed science on the American culture because they wanted to convince the American taxpayer to fund nuclear armament to beat the Soviet Union. So the people in the United States had a scientific culture. Then July 20th, 1969, the ultimate icon, you had Man on the Moon. It's amazing. It's amazing. So we all sort of, in class, we'd go to high school, and we do scientific experiments in our science classes. And you could write an equation that would come true, and you could discover some kind of mechanistic understanding of phenomena, and it could be some experiment that your teacher told you to do, mechanics or fluid flow or heat transfer or chemistry or electricity. And it's amazing because the whole thing, it would work. You'd go to high school, and you could write an equation. It would work. And it's like you feel all this power, right? So science felt good to people. So this is amazing because this is way different from 500 years ago. So what happened 500 years ago? You got all these guys. They're all Christians. Who are these guys? These are the founders of modern science. Galileo, Kepler, Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle for chemistry, James Clerk Maxwell for electrodynamics, Lavoisier chemistry, Faraday magnetism, Euler mathematics, Gregor Mendel genetics, Compton photons, Lemaitre cosmology, and Charles Babbage, who invented the modern computer. Every one of these guys were Christians. The founders of modern science were Christians. And if I had a bigger slide, I could list a lot more. A lot more. Now, why did this happen? Why did science start in Europe? Why not Africa? Why not China? Why not South America? Right? Christians began science. Why? Because they expected nature to be orderly and rational, because they believed nature came from a rational lawgiver. And so it was Christianity that drove their science. Here's an example. There's Johannes Kepler. He came up with the 3 laws of planetary motion. Here's his quote after he did this. Science is the process of thinking God's thoughts after him. Cool. Now here's 2 Nobel Prize winners. One's a Christian, one's an atheist. The top guy is Peter Higgs, and he's a British theoretical physicist known for proposing the existence of the Higgs boson particle, and he won the Nobel Prize in 2013, and he's an atheist. He doesn't believe. Then the guy on the bottom is Bill Phillips. He won the 1997 Nobel Prize for developed methods to cool and trap atoms using laser light, and he's a Christian. So what separates these guys? Not their science. They're both Nobel Prize winning scientists, but one's an atheist, one's a Christian. What separates them is their worldview. And here the Christianity conflicts with naturalism. Now here's the statistics. Nobel Prize winners. 65% Christian, only 10% atheist. That's amazing, right? You wouldn't expect that, right? Most Nobel Prize winners are Christian. Percentage of winners, right? Nobel Peace Prize, chemistry, physics, medicine, literature, pretty high percentages of Christians. And the smartest scientist in the world today, James Tour, you'll see him later, is a Christian. So what is a Christian worldview? Everybody has a worldview. It's like your answers to the big questions. Who am I? A child of God, a free will agent, a sinner. Who put me here? God is ultimately my creator. Why am I here? To know God and make him known, to have relationships with people, and to enjoy the earth. What is my purpose? Love God, love others. How am I to live? As a follower of Jesus, as a saved child of God, follow God's expectations for me. How am I to function? Love others, serve others, act consistently with the Bible. What am I to do? Share the gospel, serve Jesus, enjoy creation, and advance society. Who's keeping score? God. God knows everything and every event, every thought. God is perfectly just. What will follow this life? Well, either His will be done or your will be done. So we hope for His will. So that's a coherent Christian worldview. What about a coherent atheist worldview? This will kind of scare you. Who am I? I'm the latest in a long line of descendants. Parents, grandparents, hominids. Back far enough, I'm the descendant of a single-celled animal. Who put me here? Nobody. I'm an accident. Somehow all the necessary chemicals got together 3.86 billion years ago and sprung to life without the guiding hand of a creator. Darwinism is responsible for all that followed, and ultimately we got humans, and here I am. Why am I here? There's no absolute reason. My parents had sex, the female egg was fertilized by the male sperm, and here I am. What is my purpose? I have no purpose. If I want, I can choose a purpose. How am I to live? I can do whatever I want. I continuously respond to environmental factors, but I am free from any expectations that a God might have. How am I to function? I can file societal norms if I feel like it, or not. Personal preference. What am I to do? Anything I want. All the moral intuitions I have about right and wrong are just illusions. There's no God to define what is right and what is wrong. With no God, everyone is a little God, a godlet. So everyone is equally right. Whatever works for you, whatever is true for you. Who's keeping score? Nobody. What will follow this life? I will vanish from existence when I die. Wow. Now that's a coherent atheistic worldview, and I've met a lot of people who say they're atheists, but I don't really think they are. I think they're really anti-theists. I'll talk about that more later. But most of them cannot articulate that. They basically said, that God, He's just in there keeping me from doing what I want, so I don't believe in Him. That's what they say, right? Now, what's the problem here? Why did they get to that point? And there's really two reasons. The first reason is a confusion about who God is. And let's go back to Newton to sort of give a description of why that is. So Newton, he goes ahead and he writes the Principia Mathematica, which is the most famous book in the history of science. And he discovers gravity. And when he does, he doesn't say, I don't need God anymore. He finds genius in the way God did it. Look at what he says. This most beautiful system of the sun, the planets, and the comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. Right? He discovers gravity. He says, look at God is like so smart. He figured this out, right? Now, Stephen Hawking, he wrote the book, The Grand Design. He looks at gravity, and he comes to the opposite conclusion. He says, because there is a law such as gravity, the universe will create itself from nothing. What the heck? Newton says gravity, God. Hawking says gravity, no God, right? So let's look at seeing what the atheists say, what kind of God we're talking about. Now, this guy is Michael Shermer, and he's the editor of Skeptic Magazine, and he says this.
Over the last 10,000 years of history, there's been about 10,000 different religions and roughly about 1,000 different gods. What is the probability that Yahweh is the one true God in Amun-Ra, Aphrodite, Apollo, Baal, Brahman, Ganesha, Isis, Mithras, Osiris, Shiva, Thor, Vishnu, Wanton, Zeus, and the other 986 gods are all false gods? You guys are atheists just like me of all the gods I just rattled off. Some of us just go one God further.
So what do we say to that? All you guys out here, you're atheists with respect to Zeus and these other gods, right? And they just go one God further, right? So what's the problem? What's the problem? Atheists are confused about the definition of God. They say that you unenlightened religious believers just stick God in there wherever you need him to explain something you don't know. So if you don't understand the sun, you got a God for the sun. If you don't understand the moon, you got a God for the moon. You don't understand thunder and rain, so now you got a God for thunder and rain or behavior and all that. And so these are all created gods. It's like they came from the Marvel universe with their own origin story, right? Right? These gods descend from the heavens and the earth, and if science advances, then those gods disappear. Now let's look at an example. This is from The Simpsons. Didn't you all think you were going to come here and see The Simpsons? Okay, so let's watch.
Oh, don't be scared, boys. That's just the angels bowling.
There you go. So, thunder, right? That's just God bowling, right? So here's a Greek god. Here's Zeus, right? He's the god of lightning and the king of the other gods, right? So you go to college, you take a course in meteorology, atmospheric physics, and then you find out what thunder really is, and then God, he's out. He's out, right? It's called a god of the gaps. It's a god of the gaps. The God was defined at the beginning as somebody that fills in the gap for something that you don't understand. It's like people say, life is so complicated, God must have done it. That's a dumb thing to say. Now, the atheists think that's our idea of God. He just fills in for something we can't explain. I can't explain it in physics. I can't explain it in chemistry. I can't explain it in biology. That's where God works. But as soon as you go to class and you learn all that stuff, God's out. God's out, right? And so atheists think Christians believe God is a God of the gaps. We just plug God in when we don't understand. And so we, Christians, are intellectually lazy. And so the atheists say you have to choose between science and God. So let's look at this. How does the Bible start? Really, how does it start? In the beginning, God created the bits of the universe we don't yet understand. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say that. In the beginning, God created everything, right? God created everything. We don't believe in a God of the gaps. We believe in a God that created the bits of the universe we do understand and the bits of the universe we don't understand. He created everything. He's not a God of the gaps. So that's the first problem. Atheists think they don't understand that our God created everything. The second thing is a confusion about what is explanation. What is explanation? Now, when you go to science class, your teacher says that science explains. That's wrong. Science doesn't explain anything. That's weird, right? Science doesn't explain anything. So your teacher writes down a law of gravity, right? The force of gravity is the gravitational force constant times the mass of the first body times the mass of the second body divided by the square of the distance between them, right? So he says that's an explanation of gravity, right? No. That's not an explanation of gravity. Might surprise you, nobody knows what gravity is. Nobody in the world. We make the mistake of thinking that laws of nature are explanations when they're not. So let's see if I can demonstrate that to you. So Newton writes this book, the Principia Mathematica, right? He comes up with the law of gravity, and then he thinks, well, what is gravity? Gravity's weird, right? Because there's nothing that touches. So if I drop this, it falls. I could do that 100 times in a row. It falls. What's pushing it down? Gravity. What's gravity? It's the force that's pushing it down. What's pushing it down? Gravity. What's gravity? It's the force that's pushing it. There's nothing touching. There's no touchy, right? What is it? So Newton was really uncomfortable about this because it's action at a distance. Now, let's see if I can explain this a little more. You got a string. You got a ball and a string. You're whipping the ball around. You think you could do that? You could probably do that, right? You put the ball on the end of the string, you can whip it around in a circle, right? Pretty cool. Take away the string. Take away the string. Can you get that ball to go around your head? No, you can't do it anymore, right? All right. So, here you got the sun and the moon and the earth. The moon goes around the earth. What's pulling it around the earth? There's a string. What's pulling the earth around the sun? There's a string. But there's no string. There's no string. How's it getting around there? Is there a rod? Can we go outside and look at, there's a big rod from the earth to the sun, pulling the earth around the sun? There's no rod. Where's the force? Where's the force? There is no force. Is there a rod from the earth to the moon? I mean, you just looked at that picture of that kid, and you take away that string, and the ball won't go around his head, right? There's no touching, right? So nobody knows what gravity is. Newton knew that. Newton said, hypothesis non fingo. I feign no hypothesis. He couldn't figure out what it is. So science describes, but science does not explain. Newton's best guess was what? Constant spirit action. Now think about that. There's 10 to the 81st particles. You think constant spirit action, God is acting on all those 10 to the 81st particles as a continuous function of time? And that's the best example we got, the best explanation we got. And by the way, that isn't a religious explanation. That was a scientific explanation, that constant spirit action from the smartest scientist that ever lived. That's his explanation for gravity. Wow. So here's John Lennox, and he gives a little talk about what happened to him when he gave a talk about gravity. And let's listen.
We are bamboozled into thinking that science explains. You see, somebody comes along, Isaac Newton, and he comes with the law of gravitation. There you are, that explains it. It doesn't. Newton knew that. The law of gravity describes what happens when massive bodies. Nobody knows, ladies and gentlemen, what gravity is. I wish they'd taught me that at school. Because what we've come to think of as scientific explanation is not explanation. It gives a partial description. And Wittgenstein, no less, said this, that the great deception of modernism is that the laws of nature are explanations when they're not. Now that limits the effect of science, but I find that many people do not realize it. Richard Feynman, one of the most distinguished physicists in North America, once said, don't let anybody fool you. Nobody knows what energy is. And that's very important. I was speaking to about 500 physicists in our atomic weapons research establishment, and a physicist came up to me and he said, Professor Lennox, that was very interesting, but you know, I detect you're a Christian. He was really sharp. And he said, but you see, you as a Christian, you're obliged to believe that Jesus was a man and God at the same time, isn't that right? I said, that's right. He said, can you explain that to me? Well, I said, can I ask you a question or two first before I try to? He said, sure. I said, tell me, what is energy? Actually, what I first said to him was more difficult. I said, what is consciousness? He said, I don't know. So I said, I'll do something easier. What is energy? He said, well, we can measure it, we can use it. I said, that wasn't the question. You know it wasn't. What is it? He said, I don't know. Oh, I said, that's very interesting. Do you believe in energy and consciousness? He said, yeah, I do. And you don't know what they are. Should I write you off as a physicist? He said, please don't. I said, you are prepared to write me off. Because the nature of God, is infinitely more complex than the nature of energy, that we don't know what it is. But I said there's something else. Why do you believe in consciousness and energy when you don't know what they are? And I had to help him a bit, but I'm very kind, you see. So I have... I said, you believe in them because of their explanatory power conceptually. He said, that's right. And I said, that is exactly why I believe that Jesus is both God and human, because those are the only terms that make sense of the evidence as I see it.
There you go. So, actually, science and theism do not compete. The Atheist thinks they do. You got to choose science or God, but you don't. You don't. Let's see if I can demonstrate that. Why is the water boiling? Well, the laws of heat transfer, right? You've got the burner is putting a flame at the bottom of the copper kettle. The copper kettle, it's heating up, it's agitating the molecules of water, and it's boiling, right? That's why it's boiling, right? How about it's because I want a cup of tea? Which is the right answer? They're both right. You've got a scientific explanation and you've got an agency explanation, and you need both. You need both. The personal explanation does not compete with the scientific explanation. You need both. Beware of false alternatives. The scientific explanation is valid and the human desire explanation is valid. They do not conflict, they complement. Let's try it again. Please account for the motor car. The laws of internal combustion and mechanical engineering. Henry Ford, Carl Benz. You need both. You need a personal explanation and you need a scientific explanation. They do not compete. Both explanations are perfectly valid. If you suggest that God and science are in conflict for the explanation of the universe, that's as dumb as saying that Henry Ford is in conflict with the laws of mechanical engineering for accounting for a car. They are not the same kind of explanation. They do not conflict. They don't compete. So please account for plants and animals and anatomy and physiology. The intelligent designer, God, right? You need biology and you need God. You need both. They do not conflict. You need both. Now, what's the impact on students? Does the church prepare students for getting ready to go to university? Because if you go to university, you get these aggressive professors, and they say something like this: everything you will learn at this university will prove to you that there is no God, so you better prepare students before they go to college. Now, is the church teaching biology, biochemistry, molecular biology, genetics, chemistry, physics, astronomy, cosmology, engineering, paleontology, information science, philosophy, and law? No. So beware to get hit with secular naturalism right in the face when you go to college. Now, there's a movie about this called God Is Not Dead. Did anybody ever see that movie? About half the people saw that movie, right? And professors lecture about how there is no God when you go to college. And man, 1974, I walked into college at Purdue University. That's what happened to me. Very first day. So here's an example of what happened.
I'm Professor Radisson. This is Philosophy 150. I would like to bypass senseless debate altogether and jump to the conclusion, which every sophomore is already aware of: there is no God. All that I require from each of you is that you fill in the papers I've just given you with 3 little words: God is dead.
Wow. So that's what's going to happen? Your parents save all this money so they can send you to college, and you're going to hear this? So you better be ready. You better be ready, right? So let's look. Can scientism or atheism really defeat God? And we'll go back to by definition. Now, remember, there's 2 definitions of science in our culture, right? There's the methodological definition, where you do experiments and you follow the evidence wherever it leads. That's the good kind of science. And then there's scientism, the metaphysical definition, where science is the only way to explain anything. It's the best definition of how you explain anything. Now let's look at this quote from a leading scientist at Harvard and see, does the science come first and the philosophy later, or does his philosophy come first and the science come later. Let's see what he says. This is Richard Lamontia. He was the leading biologist at Harvard. Pretty good school, right? It is not that the methods and institutions of science compel us to accept the material explanation, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create a set of concepts that produce material explanations. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. That's ridiculous, right? He's assuming there is no God, and then he does his science. Why the heck do I want to pay money to Harvard University to hear that? I don't want to hear this guy's personal philosophy. That's wrong. That's not science at all, right? So we should go back to take the methodological definition of science. So you get these books. You get a biology book. You get a book in cosmology, astrophysics, right? The scientific evidence in those books is correct. It's correct when you look at the operation of already existing systems. If you look at the operation of already created animals and plants, biology books are correct. If you look at the operation of already created galaxies, stars, and all that, the cosmology books are correct. But their origin stories are not. And your yellow light better be blinking when you look in those scientific books for the origin stories, right? Biology textbooks are wrong about the origin of life, animals, and plants. And cosmology textbooks are a little better because sometimes they'll include explanations of God. But cosmology textbooks are misleading about the design of the universe and Earth. Intelligent design is the best explanation of cosmological and biological origins. Now, does scientism and atheism bury God by bullying? Are the atheists just a bunch of bullies, right? So here's the new atheist movement. It started in 2006. It's kind of waning right now. There's Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and they write all these books, right? Darwin's Dangerous Idea, The End of Faith, God is Not Great, The God Delusion. And these books sell a lot of copies. Now, these authors, right, they're really good speakers. They're funny. They get big audiences. They sell tens of millions of copies, these books, right? The new atheist movement. Let's look at an example. There's Sam Harris. Sam Harris wrote The End of Faith, all these other ones. This is the true horror of religion. It allows perfectly decent and sane people to believe by the billions what only lunatics could believe on their own. He's just being a bully. He's not giving any evidence, right? Christopher Hitchens. Religion is poison because it asks us to give up our most precious faculty, which is that of reason, and to believe things without evidence. It then asks us to respect this, which it calls faith. But they're not really giving any reason for that. They're just being bullies. So does science and atheism bury God by the problem of evil? The atheists claim that all the evil in the world is caused by religion. Well, some evil in the world is caused by religion, right? We experienced in 2001 an example of that. Airplanes flying into buildings in New York City, and here burning witches at the stake, right? So what is really the truth about that? Well, the paradigmatic figure of evil is Adolf Hitler, World War II, 25 to 50 million deaths. In the 1900s, 3 men presided over 150 million deaths, and they were all atheists. Stalin, 62 million deaths in Russia. Lenin, 12 million deaths. Mao, 80 million deaths in China. Can you believe that? All atheists, right? And if you got atheism, there's not even anything wrong with that, right? Ideas have consequences. Richard Dawkins, he wrote the book River Out of Eden, and he described good and evil, right? He says, the universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. So on the thing about good and evil, the atheists lose big time, right? Millions and millions and millions of people die for no reason. Now, does scientism and atheism bury God in the courts? Well, this is the place where Christianity loses, right? Because there were 3 famous Supreme Court cases in the 1980s. The most famous one is Edwards v. Aguillard in 1987, which concerned the constitutionality of teaching creationism in school, and they considered a Louisiana law that banned the creation of creation science when evolutionary science is taught. And the Supreme Court ruled that this law violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, and so that's the place where atheism is winning, in the courts. Now, what about the actual science? What about the data, right? Okay, the Big Bang. What should we think about that? You hear about the Big Bang, right? Well, the Big Bang is a pretty theistic thing. Genesis 1:3, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Well, sounds about the same. And the scientific atheists hated that because they said, wow, the Big Bang, it's like a creation event. If there was a beginning, there must have been a beginner, or else the universe just created itself from nothing for no reason. That's pretty weird, right? And so the way I usually say this to get people to remember, if there was a Big Bang, there must have been a Big Banger. Can't unhear that. Or the universe just popped itself into existence all by itself from nothing and for no reason. Now, this gets better, right? This gets better because if there was a beginning to all matter, space, time, and energy, whoever created it had to be outside matter, space, time, and energy. What does it sound like for some being to be outside of matter, space, time, and energy? Sounds a lot like what? A lot like God, right? Very good, right? So that shows scientifically that whatever created the universe had to be immaterial and personal, because only a personal being can make a choice to start something. Now, in the 1960s, the evidence for the beginning began to come out. And Robert Jastrow, who was the head of the Goddard Space Center in Houston, right, in the 1960s for the Mercury and Gemini projects, and one of the greatest astrophysicists in the U.S., he wrote this book, God and the Astronomers, and anytime you want to write a book, if you want to get more sales, you put God in the title, so he put God in the title, and he sold a lot more books, right? He says this: the world began abruptly in an act of creation. That there are what I or anyone would call supernatural forces at work is now, I think, a scientifically proven fact. Pretty good, right? So, you've got the creation. A Big Bang was caused by a Big Banger. What about cosmic fine-tuning? The universe has to be only one way. Let's watch.
From galaxies and stars, down to atoms and subatomic particles, the very structure of our universe is determined by these numbers. These are the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe. Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's breadth, no physical, interactive life of any kind could exist anywhere.
That's weird, right? Why is that? If you don't get the numbers just right, you don't get any stars. You don't get any planets. You don't get any chemistry. And you don't get any life. So the numbers have to be set just one way.
Consider gravity, for example. The force of gravity is determined by the gravitational constant. If this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist. To understand how exceedingly narrow this life-permitting range is, imagine a dial divided into 10 to the 60th increments. To get a handle on how many tiny points on the dial this is, compare it to the number of cells in your body, or the number of seconds that have ticked by since time began. If the gravitational constant had been out of tune by just one of these infinitesimally small increments, the universe would either have expanded and thinned out so rapidly that no stars could form and life couldn't exist, or it would have collapsed back on itself with the same result: no stars, no planets, and no life. Or consider the expansion rate of the universe. This is driven by the cosmological constant. A change in its value by a mere 1 part in 10 to the 120th parts would cause the universe to expand too rapidly or too slowly. In either case, the universe would again be life prohibiting. Or another example of fine-tuning. If the mass and energy of the early universe were not evenly distributed to an incomprehensible precision of 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd, the universe would be hostile to life of any kind.
Wow.
The fact is, our universe permits physical, interactive life only because these, and many other numbers, have been independently and exquisitely balanced on a razor's edge.
Now, this is not controversial, right? All science believes this, right? Here's Stephen Hawking. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. This is fine-tuning. You all have examples of fine-tuning, right? You take a shower in the morning. You adjust the hot and cold. If it's too hot, it's too cold, it's no fun. It's fine-tuned. You go to the car parts store. You get parts that are specific for your car. It's fine-tuned for your car. You don't just go there and say, give me a part. What car do you make? It doesn't matter. It does matter. You drive the car. As you're driving, you make fine-tuned adjustments to your steering. If the guy driving on this road doesn't make the right adjustments, it's not a good day, right? Right? So it's like there's a machine to generate the universe, and you got all these dials, and there's only one way you can put the dials. It looks like somebody did it. Somebody did it. So cosmic fine-tuning requires a cosmic fine-tuner. Now, I think I'm going to skip the fitness because I'm probably a little bit behind. So let me go to this next one. Planetary fitness. Is there life on other planets? Wow. Well, you got to have a whole bunch of things right to get life on any planet. And so far, we've seen about 7,000 planets, and they're not life on any of those, right? And here's a guy that is from Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and he explains why if you look at a planetary design, you got to have a whole bunch of things just right to get life. It looks like somebody did it, so let's watch.
We caught up with physicist Bijan Namadi, who was a senior engineer at NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab for over 16 years.
What we've discovered in the last few decades is that the properties of the universe in general, and our planet in particular, are fine-tuned, not just for our survival, but actually for our thriving, our benefit.
So Earth is not just habitable, it's better than that. It's hospitable. It's like this. Imagine you're a space explorer and you land on a distant planet. There's no water, no oxygen, and it's 300 degrees below zero. You're screwed. But then off in the distance you see a structure, and the closer you get, the more it looks like a house. When you open the door, you find it's been filled with warm, breathable air. You take off your spacesuit and find a faucet with drinkable water and a refrigerator stocked with healthy and delicious food. What's your first thought? The house and everything in it was the product of a mindless natural process? Or that it was designed to take care of you, to meet your needs, and that someone prepared it as a home for human beings, like you? Our planet, Earth, is that home.
So if you believe in science, then this is where the life is, unless somebody designed it. Now, how about the origin of first life? So here's like a cool slide. This took me a long time to make. That's good PowerPoint right there, boy. I'll tell you what. So origin of first life. Now, how did life happen? Because of some primordial soup, right? So here's a way you can debate all the other Nobel Prize winners and all the atheists and still win, and I've tried this about 500 times. Life is based on information. Information, when we know the causal story, always comes from an author. You see John Loves Mary on the beach, you do not infer the action of waves, erosion, and wind. You say, John wrote that, right? Even if you didn't see it, right? The information might be carried by mass and energy like the sand, right? But it is not mass and energy. Information is not mass and energy. Now, what is the longest word that we know? DNA.
Crick realizes that the 4 chemical subunits along the spine of the double helix, on the interior of the helix, are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text.
It had an uncanny resemblance to a digital bit string.
Wow. There's a lot of information there, right? How much information? 1, 2, just all those rungs. That's a word. It's a word that defines how you get proteins in your body. How long is that word? Well, in human DNA, it's 3.1 billion letters in one word. The simplest thing that we know, 1.3 million base pairs. At the origin of first life, at least 300,000 base pairs. John loves Mary, that's 13 letters. We infer an author. You see 3 billion letters. Somebody wrote it. There was only one person around at the time. Who was it? God, right? So, the origin of first life requires a chemist for the materials, an author for the information, and a computer programmer for the information processing. What about the failure of Darwinism? So Darwin comes along and he says you've got this godless, undirected process of natural selection acting on random mutation. That's what you learned in high school. There's no actual design in organism. It's just an illusion. With no design, there's nothing for God to do, so there's no designer. Now, they trick you by using multiple definitions of the word evolution. For example, definition number 1, evolution is change over time. Do you believe that there are different things living now than living in the past? I do. So you're an evolutionist. That's not very interesting though, right? That's not very interesting. The interesting part is when we tell you more. So let's look at these. These are different animal phyla, different fundamental ways of being alive. Sponges, cnidarians, arthropods, chordates. Anybody in here a chordate? Yeah, you guys are all chordates. You have a spinal cord, right? All right. So science says this. So here's the geological column. And they say you've got 800 million years ago, 600 million years ago, 400, 200 today. And you've got sponges came first, and then they evolved, and they became cnidarians, and then they evolved, and they became arthropods, and then later they evolved and became chordates. That's what you're, right? That's what you think evolution is, right? That's wrong. All those animals showed up at the very same time. Doesn't sound like evolution, does it? Right? Here's this scientific textbook, Time Magazine, 1995, Evolution's Big Bang. New discoveries show that life as we know it began in an amazing biological frenzy that changed the planet almost overnight. Does that sound like evolution? No. So here's Darwin's tree of life. This is Darwin's figure in his notebook. And Darwin said, well, you get this like single-celled animals, and it goes ahead and evolves, and it splits off, and ultimately becomes a new genus. And then another one becomes a new genus, and maybe they even become a family. That's what Darwin thought, right? Is that what happened? Is that what happened, really? So, if you go to the New York Museum of Natural History, get in your car right now, in 2 hours you'll be there, and this is what you'll see. This is what you'll see. Now, let me sort of take this apart and show you what it means. There is no tree of life. There's a lawn of life. So I split this diagram into all the different animal phyla, and then you merge them together. Good PowerPoint there, boy. Look at that, huh? See? All the animal phyla, there's diversity in the phyla over time, but there's no evolution between phyla. Anybody know a book that sounds just like this? Genesis 1, kinds. Cattle kind, snake kinds, bird kinds, fish kinds. That's exactly what happened. That's their data. That's their data. Here's Darwin's theory. Here's what really happened. Something's got to give, man. Anybody knows anything about evolution should know from the data that evolution did not happen by the data. And Darwin knew this. The case at present must remain inexplicable and may be truly urged as a valid argument against the views here entertained. That's chapter 10 of The Origin of Species, right? And look at all the books that are being written right now about this. Billions of missing links, what Darwin didn't know, Darwin devolves, why Darwin was wrong, the collapse of Darwinism, Darwin's doubt. So there's no evidence for the interesting parts of Darwinism and plenty against it. What about design in life? Darwin said if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Now, is there any examples in life that can't be built one little baby step at a time? One baby step at a time. Why did he want to do that? He wanted to get rid of all the miracles. So if he had a little baby step, it looked like an accident, right? But if you have like 50,000 baby steps and it doesn't look like an accident, it looks like a miracle, right? That's why he said that. So here's an example. This is called the bacterial flagellum. There's a bacteria that's swimming around in fluid to try and get the food, and this is the thing in the back of it that propels it around. You can't make that one step at a time. You have to have all those parts, or the bacterial flagellum doesn't work. It doesn't work. So you can't build that by Darwinism. It's impossible. It's impossible. Here's another example. Cell division. Your cells divide, right? Could you build this one step at a time? Well, here's the physiology to break the cell wall, and here's the physiology to remanufacture the cell wall. If you can't remanufacture the cell wall, it doesn't really help it to break the cell wall. You'd be dead. So you can't build this one step at a time. You have to have all those steps and all those steps all at the same time, or you're dead. You're dead. Right? So we'll give Darwinism all the anatomy and physiology that you can build one step at a time, and we'll take all the anatomy and physiology that you need multiple steps. What's the problem? There isn't anything that you can build one step at a time, right? So his theory breaks down. Multi-part systems require an engineer. Now what about humans, right? You see this pictures like this some of the time, and see these guys right here, that's your great grandparents, right? Is that true? Is that true? Is this true? Is this what happened? Is this what happened? We are just supercharged chimps. That's all we are, right? No, I don't think so. What about anatomy? Are we different than chimps? We walk and run upright, chimps don't. Chimps walk on their knuckles, humans walk on their feet. Chimps live in trees, human lives in dwellings. The feet of chimpanzees are prehensile. They can grab anything that their hands can. Not so with humans. Human feet have arches and toes for pushing off. Chimps' feet are designed for grasping. Humans have many more muscles in our hands that permit refined tool making. We have many more muscles in our tongues, allowing sounds and speech. Human spines are curved, our legs angle in so our feet are underneath us. Human necks are longer, the skull is set on top for balance. We are much more than supercharged chimps. What about physiology? Almost all humans have a handed preference. Most, 85%, are right-handed. Chimps do not. Humans sweat, apes do not. Humans can consciously hold their breath, apes cannot. Humans are the only animal that can weep. There are different reproductive systems between humans and chimps. Human young are born profoundly helpless, require long maternal care. Human females experience menopause, apes do not. Neither do any other primates. The only known mammal that experiences menopause besides the human is the pilot whale. We are much more than supercharged chimps. And we dance, we compose, write, perform music, we make musical instruments, we write plays and film movies, we have art, we draw portraits and landscapes, we think about the future, we plan, we can delay gratification for a long time, we engage in long-range trade, we have complex language, we communicate symbolically, we have mathematics, we have scientific studies, we have schools, colleges, universities, we have foresight, innovation, we domesticate animals. We wear clothing, we control fire and smelt metals and therefore develop technology. We measure time, we practice religion. We must find an answer to the God question. We care for the infirm and the elderly. We build zoos, and we are on this side of the cage. And most importantly, we play football. Our capabilities are orders of magnitude greater than anything chimps can do, and orders of magnitude more than needed for survival on the African savanna. We are much more than supercharged chimps, right? So, the trouble with science is it destroys rationality. So here's John Lennox again, and he wrote all these books, and he comes up with an explanation where he asks scientists, what do you do science with? And he points up to his head, to make it pretty obvious that you do science with your brain. And then he says, give me a story of the brain. And the scientist says, well, the brain is the result of a long, mindless evolutionary process. And Lennox says, and you trust it. If you knew the computer that you used or the instruments in your lab were the result of a mindless evolutionary process, would you trust it? Right? So let's listen.
Well, tell me, I say, what do you do science with? And I point up here to make it fairly obvious. And most of them say, well, I do it with my... And they're about to say mind when they realize it's not politically correct to believe in the mind. There's only the brain. That is a common view. You are your brain. So I let that sit for a minute. I say, okay, you do science with your brain. Tell me about your brain with which you do science. What do you really believe about it? Give me a short history of the brain. Oh, they say that's relatively easy because the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I look at them and I sometimes smile. And I say, and you trust it? Be honest with me. If you knew that the computer you use every day in your lab was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? And I always force an answer. And I've asked dozens of world-famous scientists, and every single one of them has said no.
Wow. So there's the death of atheism, right? Atheism depends on accidental mutations that cannot lead to a brain that can make rational conclusions. So the scientific evidence buries atheism itself. Now, where did Lennox get that argument? He got it from Charles Darwin. Darwin said this to a letter to William Graham in 1881. But then with me the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which is developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or are at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the conviction of a monkey's mind, if there are any convictions in such a mind? Wow, you can't get there. So here's Thomas Nagel, and he wrote this book, Mind and Cosmos. It's interesting. He says kind of the same thing on page 28. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which the evolutionary naturalism itself depends. If evolution is true, you can't trust anything. So, does scientism and atheism bury God by claiming faith? He says, you Christians are stupid. You just believe in these stupid fairy tales, right? You believe where there's no evidence. And science is the only way to know anything about anything. Really? Is that right? Well, science depends on faith. It depends on the reliability of the human mind as a source of justified beliefs about our environment. And if science is true, you don't have that. You don't have that. It believes in the reliability of human senses as truth gatherers. But if it just came from a mindless evolutionary process, you don't have that. It depends on the knowability of the external world. But if it's just a mindless evolutionary process, you don't have that. It depends on the reliability of logic, but you don't have that either, and a whole bunch of other things. Now, let's give you a way to remember this. Do you think there was a George Washington? How many people think there was a George Washington? Everybody. How do you know that? Prove it. You have no first-hand knowledge. You can do no experiment to find out. You have only read this in books or heard what other people who have read the books have told you. Someone else, not you, recorded what happened or figured it out and wrote it down. Almost everything you have ever learned, you learned this way. Do you think there was a George Washington? If you go to the airport and you read that screen, do you have faith that that'll get you to the right city? Well, you got on that airplane. You had faith, right? Do you think that the Green Bay Packers beat the Kansas City Chiefs in Super Bowl I 35-10? Were you there? Did you see it? Did you read it in a book? Do you think there was Jesus? Right? How do you know? How do you know? Testimony of a reliable witness. There's a name for that. Faith. Almost everything you learn by faith. And the Bible is full of explanations of faith. Like here in John, right? There's many other signs so that you may believe. So, do you have enough faith to be an atheist? You got all this evidence pointing in the other direction. Here's the amount of faith you would have to be an atheist. In the Big Bang, well, creation happened all by itself from nothing for no reason. Wow. But nothing is not nothing. Cosmic fine-tuning. There's an infinite number of parallel universes and somebody had to win. We're the winner. Nature's prior fitness. I'll skip that one. The Earth. There's lots of Earth-like planets even though we can't find any. We should keep looking. After all, the universe is a big place. The origin of life. Nobody knows. Please use your tax dollars to fund us more. The origin of plants and animals. Darwinism can do anything. Full stop. Even without a shred of evidence. The failure of Darwinism. R&D should be funded more with your tax dollars and stop asking where the information in DNA comes from. Multi-part systems are engineered. Darwinism. Even though Darwinism is one part at a time. Humans are really different. No, they aren't. Humans are souped-up apes. The cause of evil. Religion. So all this stuff is against the evidence, but that's what you got to believe to be an atheist. So the bad news is really bad. The reason that culture is so messed up is that we live in post-Christianity and our country acts as if God is not our creator. But the good news is if you follow the evidence where it leads, science points right to God. Right to God. So a better plan, right? Science points right to God. Still, we can still do science. What is science? Science is the study of how already created systems work. That's what science is good at, right? We should stop lying to everyone and instead say what science says, that God created the universe and life.